Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Once Upon a Time in Nazi-Occupied Tunisia by Josh Azouz. So this is an interesting play that I kind of have mixed feelings about as a piece. On the one hand, I think the subject matter is actually really, really interesting because often when we think about World War II and about the Holocaust in particular, we think about Europe. Right? We think about Germany, we think about Poland, we think about Ukraine, we think about Czechoslovakia, Russia, even France, places like this. But the Nazi occupation extended beyond Europe itself into North Africa. And of course, North Africa has a very long established, or had at least a very long established Jewish population, in part because of trade routes throughout the Islamic world. And Jews, we of course have a long history as merchants, as traders, as people who traveled around because we could do business internationally with Jewish communities in cities across the world. And yet, at the same time, one of the problems, of course, of the Jewish diasporic experience is that we have never been at home, right? We have always been, as one of the characters, Lois puts it, so this play follows or focuses on two couples in Nazi-occupied Tunisia. Victor and Lois are a Jewish couple, and Yusuf and Faiza are a Muslim Arab couple. And as Lois puts it, toward the end, Lois wants to go to Palestine, to sort of flee to Nazi-occupied Tunisia. And Yusuf asks, is your heart actually set on Palestine? And Lois says, where else should we go? Italy was our home until it wasn't. Hungary was our home until it wasn't. Portugal was our home until it wasn't. Spain was our home until it wasn't. Russia was our home until it wasn't. Germany was our home until it wasn't. France was our home until it wasn't. Tunisia was our home. And Yusuf says, it's still your home. Lois says, maybe, or maybe it has revealed something we always knew. Only we pushed it so far into the back of our minds we thought it had gone away. We're guests in this country. Yusuf says, you've been here for hundreds of years. And Lois says, we've been guests in other people's homes for thousands of years, and we're good guests. We bring gifts, we take off our shoes at the door, sing for our supper, help with the washing up. But there comes a point in the evening where the host says enough is enough. It's 5 a.m., I want to go to bed with my own family in my own home. Can you stop talking? Can you stop asking questions? Just fuck off. After 2,000 years, we finally got the message. We're fucking off. Back to our own home. Now, I'm not a Zionist, I'll tell you that. Straight up, I'm more in the vein of the old Jewish Workers Bund. I believe in international Judaism. I believe in the diaspora. I would rather speak Yiddish than Hebrew. I don't speak either, but I would rather speak Yiddish than Hebrew. But this is one of those things. This is a sort of central tension of the play, is that in places like Tunisia, which were occupied by the Nazis and which therefore experienced systemic legalized antisemitism, it created these dynamic tensions. In this case, Muslims, but we saw the same thing in Eastern Europe, even in France. Anti-Semitism that often had not really been a central feature of the culture, or that had been sort of largely repressed or sort of simmering at a low level, becomes much more apparent when the Nazis sort of license people to be anti-Semitic. We're seeing the same kind of thing right now in the US, where racism is re-emerging with vengeance, in part racism and xenophobia, as well as homophobia, transphobia, etc., etc. All of these things are re-emerging with a vengeance, in large part because Donald Trump has given people license to be their worst selves. And so in this play, we have these two couples, Victor and Lois, and Yusuf and Faiza. They were friends prior to the occupation. They were really good friends. The problem becomes that Victor is detained by the Nazis. He's put into a work camp, and then we sort of meet him in this fairly horrific situation where he's buried up to his neck in the sand, and he's basically just been left there. And Yusuf, who has taken a job as a cook for the Nazis, because that's the work that's available to him, when we meet him, he is tasked by one of the Nazis, by one of the Germans, with coming out and peeing on Victor's head, basically to humiliate Victor, to sort of penalize him for whatever transgression it was. And initially we have the very strong sense that Yusuf does this because more or less he has to, right? He has to obey the commands of the Nazis for whom he works, or he himself will face reprisals. And that's a reasonable ethical position. Whether or not we sort of accept Nazi collaboration as an acceptable course of action in order to save oneself and one's family, that kind of depends on your ethical standards, but it's a perfectly understandable course of action. Yusuf also attempts to help Victor as much as he can, like he secretly brings him drinks, puts sunscreen on his shaved head so that he can sort of minimize how much sunburn he's getting, things like this. So he does genuinely attempt to help and genuinely attempt to subvert Nazi violence toward Victor, while also being part of the infrastructure that supports the Nazi occupation and the detention of his Jewish friend. That relationship and Yusuf's moral culpability becomes much more complicated later on in the play when we find out that Yusuf has had an affair with Lois. So while Victor is in the Nazi camps, Yusuf, who is working for the Nazis as a cook, slept with Victor's wife, cheated on Faiza, who was carrying his child, in order to sleep with Lois. Not ideal. Not an ideal situation. But that actually complicates the interpersonal relationship and the question of moral culpability for Yusuf in a really interesting way, because we now have to sort of reassess, is there some part of Yusuf, and he does, toward the end of the play, try and convince Lois to basically run away with him. Is there some part of Yusuf that would welcome it if the Nazis killed Victor, who is, of course, his rival for Lois, in a sense? I don't know that the play necessarily supports that, but I think it's hard to fully dismiss that idea. So this is one of the central tensions of the play, is this question of the difficult complex position in which Arab Muslim Tunisians found themselves under the occupation, because they themselves were not being targeted particularly by the Nazis, at least according to this play. I don't know that much about the history of this period in Tunisia or any period in Tunisian history, but the Nazis ended French colonial rule in Tunisia, obviously by conquering the territory, by conquering the colony. And one of the things the Nazis would sometimes do, particularly in Arab states, is they would promise liberation and an indigenous, in this case, Tunisian government. And that was a very powerful draw for many Tunisians because, of course, by the 1950s and 60s, the anti-colonial movement would become very, very important in the world, and the French Empire, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, etc., would lose a lot of their colonies, including France's colonial possessions in North Africa. And so Yusuf sort of talks about this, the difficulty of this situation. Not difficulty, the complexity, I guess, of this situation. So he's talking to Faiza, his wife. He had been at this political meeting, and he says, the motion was about whether we cooperate. A young guy stood up to oppose. He told the room that the blondes shouldn't be trusted. They refer to the Nazis as blondes, typically. That one blonde in particular had touched his wife. Faiza says, touched? Yusuf says, yes, I don't. Faiza says, right. Yusuf says, for the husband to stand up and oppose, that took courage. He was vulnerable. He required support, some affirmation. I couldn't look in his eyes. And the room, the party, they laughed, and then they shouted him down. They stood up, pointed their fingers, and I stood up and pointed and called him a liar, saying one anecdote about one blonde shouldn't dictate the direction of the party. I want to believe these blondes, their promises, our own country. How many more years of dependency? But the guy who opposed, he was shaking. He was weak. I felt an urge to kick him. And so we get this sort of difficulty, this complexity to the experience, because the promise of self-rule, the promise of an independent Tunisia run by Tunisians, is a powerful promise in contrast to French colonialism. And so we have these questions of moral culpability and the participation in or support of organized Nazi anti-Semitic violence. At the same time, we have some Nazis themselves. We have characters like Little Fella, who's just a sort of violent Nazi thug. There's not much complexity to him. He's cruel, but that's about it. But then we have Grandma. So Grandma is an older guy. He's one of those sort of quirky, sophisticated Nazis you sometimes get in media. He knits, which is how he got his nickname. He is a killer, but he's not a killer as such, in the sense that he kills. He is a Nazi, he kills by definition. That's what Nazis do. Fuck Nazis. Not in the sense of have sex with them, in the sense of they can fuck off. I think hopefully that was fairly obvious. So he does kill, but he's not a killer in the way that Little Fella is. He's not this sort of cold, brutal dude. He is this guy who intellectualizes his role within the Nazi system and within the mechanics of violence that the Nazis utilized for the Holocaust. And he is philosophical in a way. He comes and he eats dinner with Lois. And he sort of forces her to cook. And he makes this sort of essentializing argument. So at one point he says, okay, so I'm going to pull this back a little bit. So he says to Lois, the Arabs are an enigma. They've yet to fully succumb to our charms in the same way that the Poles or the Romanians or the French or the Dutch or the Austrians or the Czechs or the Greeks or the Hungarians or the Latvians or the Lithuanians or the Italians or the Yugoslavians or the Luxembourgians have. He clearly does not really know about the resistance movements in all of those countries. Or maybe he does know and he's ignoring them for the sake of propagandizing. But the Arabs, they won't show their hand. I'm not concerned. Early days. And he eats. Madame Buonfaro, it's criminal to be enjoying such a delicious stew alone. Eat. Lois takes another mouthful of stew. Beat. Lovely neighborhood. Entirely different to the Jewish quarter. It's like we're in another country. Cities can be like that, can't they? Beat. Lois says, one day the world will turn away from you. Grandma says, do you think? Much of the world has taken us to their hearts. Lois says, for now. Grandma says, what do you anticipate changing? Lois says, they'll see through you. Grandma says, and what will they find? Lois says, you're boring. Grandma says, boring? Lois says, to reduce everyone to one word. Grandma says, how so? Lois says, look, there walks a Jew. Grandma says, we're distilling, not reducing. Lois says, whatever, it's boring. Nobody wants to be just one thing. They want to be many things. Grandma says, who has the luxury to be many things? Lois says, people who refuse the labels the world sticks on them. Grandma says, you talk from privilege, Madame Buonfaro. Most people are forced to play the parts the world sees them in. Lois says, you're not exactly helping matters. Grandma says, we're trying to define the essence of people. Lois says, what do you know about my essence? Grandma says, you walk into a room and people learn you're a Jew. They might not shoot you, but they will reframe you. Either way, every other way you describe yourself will be colored with knowledge of your Jewishness. Understand we're not changing human nature. We're simply pointing out who people are. So he is this kind of philosopher Nazi. And again, this is a strange, enigmatic figure that seems to show up in a lot of media about Nazis. And certainly there were philosophical Nazis. That's a historical truth. And yet, it is this odd fascination, right? Because at its core, Nazi ideology is not philosophical. It is simplistic. Germans are the master race. Everyone else is subordinate. It is Germany's historical destiny to dominate the world. Everything else is window dressing. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that is what Nazism is about. And the idea that there's a Nazi philosophy or Nazi philosophers as such, I think is in a way an attempt by media or artists maybe to ignore or make sense of the fact that the Nazis were boring. That there is not much to Nazism at the end of the day. It is just that. It is just essentializing and hierarchical superiority.